The word Antichrist appears in the Bible exactly 4 times. Not in Revelation, not in the book everyone assumes it's from. All 4 appearances are in one short letter written by John to a small community worried about people leaving their church. That's it. No beast rising from the sea in that letter. No number. No 7-year countdown. No stadium-sized battle at a place called Armageddon. Everything you think you know about the Antichrist, the world leader, the mark on the hand, the 7 years, the countdown to the end. That entire story was assembled later, stitched together out of 3 completely different texts, written by 3 different authors, centuries apart, for 3 completely different audiences who were not thinking about the end of the world the way we do. So tonight, we're doing something most end times content never actually does. We're going to ignore the movies, ignore the paperback thrillers, ignore 2,000 years of finger-pointing, and go back to what the text itself says, sentence by sentence. We're going to watch history get this wrong over and over, with total confidence, generation after generation. And then, once we've cleared all of that away, we're going to rebuild the actual picture from the 3 original sources and walk through, step by step, how Christian tradition says this really ends. Because here's the uncomfortable part. Once you strip away every wrong guess in history, what's left isn't nothing. It's a strangely specific, strangely consistent shape. And by the end of this video, you may find yourself looking at the news a little differently. Part 1. The word nobody actually read. Let's start with that letter because almost nobody has actually read it. It's called 1 John, written near the end of the 1st century, likely from an aging leader of a small Christian community writing to people he clearly loves and is worried about. And here's what he says, roughly. You have heard that Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come. Plural. Present tense. He's not describing a single future world ruler. He's describing people who used to be part of the church and left it. Teachers denying that Jesus had truly come in the flesh. For John, Antichrist wasn't a title for one cosmic supervillain arriving at the end of history. It was a category. Anyone opposing Christ, undermining the truth about him, actively working against the community. That person was, in John's words, an Antichrist, small a. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because it means the single most famous name in end times theology isn't actually a name the Bible ever assigns to a specific final villain. It's a description John applied broadly to people in his own congregation, in his own decade. Later readers took the word and went looking for a bigger, singular target to attach it to, and found one, not in John's letter, but in 2 entirely different texts John probably never even read. So if the word itself doesn't give us the beast, the number, or the timeline, where did all of that come from? From 2 other places entirely. A vision an exiled prophet named Daniel had roughly 6 centuries before John was even born, and a warning the Apostle Paul wrote to a panicking church in Thessalonica, worried the end had already started without them. 3 separate texts, 3 separate moments in history. Only later readers wove them into a single character. And once that character existed in the popular imagination, readers started hunting for his face everywhere they looked. Which means before we can talk about how the end of the world actually happens, we have to talk about how a single made-up character got assembled out of spare parts, and how, for 2,000 years, almost every generation of Christians has been completely convinced they were staring right at him. It's worth being clear about the mechanics of that assembly because it didn't happen all at once. Early church writers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, figures like Irenaeus and later Hippolytus, were already cross-referencing Daniel, Paul, and John's revelation together, treating them as pieces of one connected story rather than 3 unrelated texts. By the time you reach the Middle Ages, This composite figure had a name everyone recognized, a rough biography, and an expected role in a coming drama, even though no single verse in the Bible ever lays that biography out in one place. What you inherited, watching sermons or movies about this topic today, isn't the text. It's roughly 18 centuries of accumulated commentary, laid one interpretive layer on top of another, until the commentary itself started to feel like scripture. Part 2. The first suspect. Let's go to the original crime scene. The Book of Revelation, written near the end of the 1st century, most likely under the Roman Emperor Domitian, to 7 small, struggling churches in what's now Western Turkey. Revelation chapter 13 describes a beast rising out of the sea, a monstrous hybrid creature with the body of a leopard, the feet of a bear, the mouth of a lion, 7 heads, 10 horns, ruling with total authority, demanding worship, and marking his followers so that no one could buy or sell without his mark. And then, almost as an aside, the text gives readers a puzzle. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Here's what almost never makes it into the popular version of this story. Ancient readers weren't confused by that instruction. They knew exactly what to do with it, because in both Hebrew and Greek, letters doubled as numbers. There was no separate numeral system. You spelled a name, and the letters added up to a total. This was a common practice called gematria, and educated readers in the 1st century used it constantly, including as a form of coded political commentary too dangerous to say out loud under an empire that executed people for treason. When scholars run the name Nero Caesar through Hebrew letter values, transliterated the way a 1st century Jewish reader would have written it, the letters add up to exactly 666. Some ancient manuscripts of Revelation actually preserve a variant number, 616, which is exactly what you get if you spell the same name slightly differently, dropping the final N, the way Latin speakers would have written it. 2 different spellings, 2 different totals, same emperor. That's not scholars stretching to make something fit. That's a strong signal the original readers were meant to catch it, and that different copyists in different regions were independently solving the same riddle. And Nero fits the description disturbingly well. He was the first emperor to launch an organized, state-level persecution of Christians, famously blaming them for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD and having them executed in his own gardens. Some, according to the Roman historian Tacitus, burned alive as human torches to light his private parties. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god, minted coins depicting himself with divine imagery, and had at least one senator executed for failing to look sufficiently grief-stricken at a public reading of his poetry. He was, by every account that survives, a genuinely monstrous ruler. And after he died by suicide in 68 AD, a strange legend took hold across the Eastern Empire. The rumor that Nero wasn't really dead, that he'd fled east and would return one day with a Parthian army to reclaim his throne. Historians call this the Nero Redivivus legend, and it was widespread enough that at least 3 separate imposters showed up in the following decades, claiming to be the returned emperor, gathering real followers each time. Revelation 13 actually describes the beast as having a fatal wound that was healed. The beast that was and is not, and yet will come. Read against that background. It isn't primarily a prediction about a distant future ruler. It's a coded, dangerous message for people living under Rome right then. Your worst enemy, the man responsible for burning Christians alive, is going to come back. Stay faithful. Don't take the mark. Don't burn incense to Caesar's image just to keep your ration card. This will end. That's suspect number 1. And for the first Christians who actually received this letter, hiding it, copying it by hand, reading it aloud in secret, the case looked closed. Part 3. A prophecy that outlived its target. Except Nero never came back. The Roman Empire didn't fall in their lifetime. The second coming they expected any day didn't arrive, and the generation that received revelation as a live warning about their own moment eventually died, while the text stayed behind, copied, translated, and carried forward into communities who had never lived under Nero at all. This is the part almost nobody talks about, and it's the actual engine driving everything that follows in this video. Apocalyptic literature, as a genre, was never built to expire. Ancient apocalyptic texts, and there were many circulating in Judaism and early Christianity beyond just Revelation, most of which never made it into any Bible, used a deliberately flexible symbolic vocabulary. Beasts, horns, numbers, colors. None of it tied permanently to one irreplaceable historical name. It was built that way on purpose, partly for survival. Coded language protected the author and readers from Roman authorities who would have executed anyone caught writing open political rebellion, and partly because the genre's entire purpose was to comfort people living under crushing power, in any era, by promising that power does not get the last word. So the moment Nero's generation passed and the text remained, something predictable happened. New readers, under new emperors, under new empires entirely, opened the same book and recognized their own tyrant in the same symbols. The beast didn't need to be reinterpreted through some elaborate scholarly process. The imagery was general enough that it simply kept fitting. Every single generation that felt persecuted, felt like the world was ending, felt like ultimate evil had a face, found that face already waiting for them in a 2,000-year-old book. Which brings us to the parade. Part 4, the parade of candidates. Let's move fast here, because once you see the pattern, the examples multiply almost faster than we can list them. Early church writers after Nero pointed at Domitian himself, the very emperor under whom John likely wrote Revelation in the first place, another ruler who demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, and persecuted Christians for refusing. Move forward almost 1,000 years into the Middle Ages, and the finger-pointing turns inward. During the long, bitter power struggles between rival popes and Holy Roman emperors, periods where 2 or 3 men simultaneously claimed to be the legitimate pope, an era historians call the Papal Schisms. Each side accused the other's pope of being the Antichrist in official writings circulated across Europe. This wasn't fringe muttering scrawled in a margin. It was formal political rhetoric between the most powerful institutions on the continent, printed, preached from pulpits, and used to justify excommunications on both sides. Then the Reformation detonates everything. In 1520, Martin Luther published a treatise formally identifying the papacy itself, not one particular pope, the office, the institution, as the seat of the Antichrist described in 2 Thessalonians, the man of lawlessness, who takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. This wasn't a fringe opinion, Luther muttered once in frustration. It became embedded, explicitly, in official Protestant confessions of faith across multiple denominations for centuries. The Westminster Confession among them. Language some of these documents technically still contain, unrevised to this day. Meanwhile, Catholic writers pointed straight back, identifying various Protestant reformers as forerunners of the Antichrist in their own pamphlets and formal condemnations. 2 massive branches of the same faith, both certain, both citing the same handful of verses, both accusing the other of being the beast, and both willing to go to war over it. The wars of religion that tore through Europe for over a century were fought, in part, by people who genuinely believed they were fighting the Antichrist's army. England had its own chapter. During the English Civil War in the 1640s, radical Puritan preachers openly identified King Charles I with the beast of Revelation, while royalist writers just as confidently pointed the accusation at Oliver Cromwell once he rose to power. Both sides had pamphlets. Both sides had scripture citations. Both sides were certain. Jump to the early 1800s, when Napoleon Bonaparte was tearing through Europe, crowning himself emperor, exiling popes, and appearing genuinely unstoppable. Preachers across the continent ran his name through gematria and found ways to make the letters land on 666. The same trick that worked for Nero, deployed on an entirely different man, in an entirely different century, using an entirely different alphabet and a different national obsession. Cross the Atlantic and 19th century America produces its own wave. Some abolitionist preachers identified the institution of slavery itself with the beast's economic control over buying and selling. Some Southern preachers, defending slavery, pointed the same accusation back at the growing power of the federal government. During the American Civil War, soldiers on both sides carried Bibles annotated with notes, convincing themselves the other side's cause was literally satanic. Jump again to the 20th century, and the candidates multiply almost yearly. Mussolini, briefly, for reviving the old symbols of imperial Rome and marching on the very city where the beast's story began. Hitler, with entire books published during World War II attempting to calculate 666 out of his name in multiple languages and alphabets, and preachers across America and Britain naming him from the pulpit with total confidence that this, finally, was the one. Stalin, for atheist communism's persecution of the church, matched against Cold War fears of the Soviet Union as a power from the North, pulled loosely from separate apocalyptic imagery in the Book of Ezekiel. Then, as the year 2000 approached, an entirely new wave of best-selling books and sermons insisted the coming Y2K computer bug itself might trigger the exact economic collapse Revelation predicted. The beast's mark, reimagined as barcode technology and electronic banking records that would supposedly fail catastrophically at midnight. Every single one of these predictions was made by serious people, respected theologians, best-selling authors, popular preachers with enormous followings, sometimes millions of readers who reorganized their finances, their families, and in some documented cases, their entire lives around the certainty that they were watching the final chapter unfold in real time. And it isn't just about naming a villain. Entire organized movements have staked their credibility on naming a date instead. The Jehovah's Witnesses, as an organization, publicly set 1914 as the year Christ's invisible reign would begin, then quietly revised expectations toward 1925, then again toward 1975. Each date arriving and passing, like the ones before it, with official publications afterward explaining, retroactively, why the calculation had needed adjusting. In 2011, an American radio broadcaster named Harold Camping used a private numerical formula applied to the biblical text to announce a specific date and even a specific hour for the rapture, May 21st, spending millions of dollars on billboards across the world. Some of his followers gave away their savings and possessions beforehand, certain they wouldn't need them. The date passed like an ordinary Saturday, and even in the last few years, as digital identification systems, biometric payment technology, and centralized health passports have expanded rapidly across the world, the same instinct has resurfaced online in a new costume. New claims that this specific piece of infrastructure, this specific database, is finally the mark of the beast made literal. We're not here to tell you those claims are true or false. We're here to point out that we've now watched this exact same reflex fire, with total sincerity, roughly once a generation, for 2,000 years running. And every single one of them turned out to be wrong. So here's where a lesser video stops, right at the punchline that everyone throughout history has been a gullible fool falling for the panic of their own moment. That's a cheap ending. It's also, we think, the wrong one. Because something survives underneath every single failed guess. Something the text itself actually specifies, not a name, but a shape. And once you clear away Nero and the popes and Napoleon and Hitler and Y2K, that shape is still standing there, untouched by any of the wrong guesses history threw at it. So let's go find it. Part 5. 3 Witnesses. To do this properly, we need three texts, written across roughly 600 years, by three men who almost certainly never read each other's specific work. And yet, when you lay their descriptions side by side, they describe something startlingly, precisely consistent. Witness 1. The prophet Daniel, writing during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC, a Jewish official serving in a foreign court that had just destroyed his homeland's temple. In chapter 7, Daniel describes a vision of four monstrous beasts rising one after another out of a churning, wind-torn sea. Most scholars read these as a sequence of empires, culminating in a terrifying fourth beast, different from all the others, with iron teeth that devours and crushes everything before it, trampling whatever is left with its feet. Out of this fourth beast grows a little horn among 10 others, a ruler who speaks great things against God, wages war against God's people, and for a time actually prevails against them and attempts to change the set times and the laws. Later, in chapter 9, Daniel receives an even stranger, more mathematically precise vision. A coming ruler who will make a strong covenant with many for a set period of time. And then, in the middle of that period, put a stop to sacrifice and offering, and set up something Daniel calls an abomination that causes desolation. A deliberate act of religious violation in the holiest possible place, the temple itself. Witness 2. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Thessalonica sometime in the early AD 50s, roughly 5 centuries after Daniel, in a completely different language, addressing a completely different crisis. Paul's church had gotten the alarming idea that the end had already happened without them, that they'd somehow missed it. And Paul writes to calm them down by explaining what has to happen first, as if working from a shared checklist his readers would already recognize. He describes a coming man of lawlessness, a son of destruction, who will oppose and exalt himself over every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Paul adds a detail nobody else gives us. This figure is currently being held back by something. Paul calls it simply the restrainer, almost cryptically, as though his readers already knew exactly what he meant and didn't need it spelled out. And only once that restraint is removed will the man of lawlessness be revealed. And crucially, Paul says, his coming will be with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception. Meaning, whatever this figure does, it will look convincing. It will look like a miracle, not a threat. Witness 3. John, in Revelation, writing roughly 40 years after Paul, describing the beast we already met. The one requiring worship, marking his followers, controlling commerce, and working alongside a second beast, a false prophet figure who performs deceptive signs, even calling down what looks like fire from heaven, specifically to convince the world to worship the first beast's image. It's worth pausing on how unusual this actually is, historically. Daniel and John weren't writing in a vacuum. Apocalyptic literature was its own recognized genre in the ancient world, and readers in both their eras would have immediately understood the conventions being used. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran in the 20th century, reveal an entire Jewish community living in the desert in the century before Christ, organizing their whole lives around the belief that a final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness was imminent, complete with detailed military manuals for a war they expected within their own lifetimes. Other Jewish texts from the same broad period, like the Book of Enoch, widely read and quoted by early Christians, including, briefly, by the New Testament Book of Jude, though it never became part of the standard biblical canon, describe fallen angels, coming judgment, and cosmic battles in vivid, symbolic detail. This was a living, shared vocabulary. Daniel and John weren't inventing a private code. They were writing within a genre their first readers already knew how to decode, using imagery that would have been immediately, viscerally familiar, even if the exact application was new. Now here is the part that should actually stop you. These aren't three versions of the same story, copied from each other. Daniel wrote in Aramaic and Hebrew during a Babylonian and Persian court, half a millennium before Christ was born. Paul wrote in Greek to a small Macedonian congregation of recent converts. John wrote in Greek from exile on a rocky prison island called Patmos, most likely under active Roman persecution. There's no manuscript evidence any of them had read the other's specific wording. Paul quotes Daniel's imagery in passing, but writes his own account largely independently. And John's Greek shows almost no direct literary dependence on Paul's letter at all. And yet when you strip away every date, every historical costume, every failed guess history has hung on this figure, the composite that remains, built independently 3 separate times across 3 languages and 6 centuries, has an oddly rigid, repeating shape. Part 6. What the text actually builds. So let's build it. Piece by piece, cited directly against the 3 texts. No guessing, no Hollywood. First, he doesn't arrive through conquest. He arrives through politics. Daniel's little horn rises up among 10 other horns, meaning he emerges from within an existing coalition of powers, not as an outside invader crashing through the gate. He is one of several contenders who becomes greater than the rest, from the inside. Second, he comes to power through deception and alliance, not war. Daniel 9 describes him making, or in some translations, confirming, as though it already existed in some form, a covenant, a formal agreement with the many for a fixed period. Paul reinforces this by saying his arrival comes with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception. This is not a tyrant seizing a throne by force in the night. This is someone the world initially welcomes, likely as a peacemaker, a unifier, someone offering a genuine solution to an existing global crisis so severe that people are desperate enough to accept nearly anyone who promises to fix it. Third, there's a delay built into the story on purpose. Paul is explicit that something, the restrainer, is currently holding this figure back, and he cannot appear until that restraint is removed. Christian tradition has debated for centuries what this restrainer actually is. Some early writers thought it meant the Roman Empire itself, as the one force keeping global chaos in check in their own day. Others read it as human government broadly, as an institution. Others as the active, ongoing presence of the Holy Spirit working through the church in the world. Whatever it specifically is, the structure of the prophecy insists this figure cannot simply show up whenever he wants on anyone's schedule. Something has to give way first, and only then does the window open. Fourth, partway through his rule, something breaks. Daniel's ruler, in the middle of the week, a set period the vision describes in numbered terms, stops the sacrifices and sets up the abomination of desolation. Paul's man of lawlessness takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Jesus himself, in Matthew chapter 24, directly quotes Daniel's exact phrase, the abomination of desolation, standing in the holy place, and tells his followers that when they see it, they should flee to the mountains immediately without even going back for their coat, because what follows is great tribulation, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. 3 separate texts from 3 separate centuries point to the exact same turning point. A moment where a covenant of peace collapses into an act of open religious blasphemy, staged deliberately in the most sacred location available. Fifth, he governs through economics, not just fear. Revelation 13 describes a second beast, a false prophet figure, who ensures no one can buy or sell without a mark bearing the first beast's name or number, on their right hand or on their forehead. Strip away the barcode theories, the microchip panic, and the decades of speculative technology guessing that this detail has generated And what's left in the text itself is simpler and honestly more chilling than any single gadget. Total economic dependence on loyalty to one system, enforced universally, with no practical way to opt out and still participate in ordinary life. Buying food, earning wages, existing inside the economy at all. Sixth, it ends suddenly, and not by human hands. Every one of these three texts agrees on this point independently, without any of them coordinating the wording. Daniel says the little horn will be broken, but not by human hands. Paul says the Lord Jesus will overthrow him with the breath of his mouth and destroy him by the splendor of his coming. Not an army, not a rebellion, a presence. Revelation describes the beast and the false prophet being seized and thrown, still alive, into the lake of fire at Christ's return, their armies destroyed by a word rather than a battle. This figure does not get toppled by a rival army, a palace coup, an election, or a popular uprising. In every single account, across every century that produced them, his reign ends because of one direct external intervention, not a gradual collapse engineered from the inside. So this is the shape underneath every wrong guess in history. Not a name, not a nationality, not a century. A pattern. Rises from within a coalition, not conquest from outside. Gains power through deception and a false peace, not open war. Is held back until a specific restraint is removed, on a timeline no human controls. Breaks his own covenant with an act of desolation staged in a sacred place. Controls the world through commerce and dependency, not just violence. And falls suddenly, completely, not by human hands. It's also worth pausing on exactly what kind of worship the text describes, because it isn't framed as private belief. It's framed as public, compulsory religious performance, with real consequences for refusal, uncomfortably similar to what Roman citizens already lived under. Emperor worship was not some abstract theological formality in the first century. It was official state religion, marked by regular sacrifices, oaths, and civic loyalty tests woven directly into trade guilds and public life. And refusing it, as many early Christians did, carried real, sometimes fatal, consequences. Revelation's beast simply completes that logic at a global scale. Worship not as a personal, private choice, but as the precondition for participating in ordinary society at all. There is a seventh piece worth naming separately because it's the one detail most adaptations quietly drop. He does not act entirely alone. Revelation 11. In the middle of describing this whole sequence, introduces two unnamed figures called simply the two witnesses, described in language echoing both Moses and Elijah, given power to prophesy publicly for a fixed period, defended by supernatural means, who are eventually killed by the beast in a public spectacle the whole world watches and celebrates, their bodies left unburied in the street as a kind of trophy. Before, 3.5 days later, they're raised back to life in front of everyone. In a moment, the text says, causes terror across the world. Almost every reading of this figure treats the two witnesses as a direct countersymbol to the beast and the false prophet. 2 verses 2, faithful testimony against total deception, playing out publicly on the same stage, in full view of the same global audience. Whatever else the sequence includes, the tradition is consistent that this figure's rise is never depicted as an uncontested victory. It's depicted as a contest, visible to everyone, right up until the very end. Nero fit some of it: the persecution, the demand for worship, the wound that seemed healed. The medieval popes and rival emperors fit almost none of it. No covenant, no temple, no sudden supernatural ending. Napoleon and Hitler fit the fear and the scale of the cruelty, but not the false peace, not the covenant, not the ending arriving by something other than human force. That's precisely why every single guess in history has eventually failed. Each one grabbed a piece of the fear and the cruelty on the surface, but none of them ever completed the whole shape underneath it. Part 7. How it ends. So if that's who he is, what happens next, according to the same tradition, once he's actually revealed? Christian eschatology has never agreed on every detail here. There are genuinely different schools of thought about the timeline, the order of events, and how literally to read some of this imagery. And honest scholars will tell you that plainly, rather than pretending there's one settled answer. But if we follow the composite sequence most directly built from Daniel, Paul, and Revelation read together, here's the shape of the ending itself, stage by stage. After the covenant breaks and the abomination of desolation is set up in the temple, the tradition describes a period of intense hardship, what Jesus called Great Tribulation, marked in Revelation by a sequence of escalating judgments unfolding in 3 waves. First, 7 seals are broken one by one, releasing what later tradition nicknamed the 4 horsemen: conquest, war, famine, and death, riding out in sequence, each one a direct consequence of the one before it, alongside a 5th seal revealing the souls of those already martyred for their faith, crying out for how much longer this will continue. Then 7 trumpets sound, each one triggering a specific ecological and cosmic catastrophe. A third of the earth burned, the seas turned to blood, waters made bitter and poisonous, the sky itself darkened. Finally, 7 bowls of what the text calls God's wrath are poured out, escalating further still. Painful sores, seas fully turned to blood, rivers poisoned, scorching heat, darkness, a climactic battle gathering at a place the Hebrew text calls Har Megiddo, the hill of Megiddo, the origin of the word Armageddon, and finally a catastrophic earthquake, such as had not occurred since mankind has been on the earth. Read plainly, this isn't random chaos for its own sake. It's structured as an unraveling, the ordinary systems that hold a functioning civilization together, breaking down one after another, in escalating waves, as the false peace that this ruler promised finally reveals what was actually underneath it the whole time. Then, according to the text, comes the interruption nobody sees coming, not a slow decline finally reaching bottom. A sudden, visible event, described across the New Testament as Christ's return, coming on the clouds with power and great glory, visible, according to Revelation, to every eye, not a private or symbolic event confined to believers, but something the entire world witnesses simultaneously, everywhere, at once. Revelation 19 pictures this arrival as a rider on a white horse leading an army out from heaven, and describes the beast and the false prophet being seized on the spot and thrown directly into judgment. Their reign doesn't fade out through negotiation or gradual defeat. It's simply stopped. What follows in Revelation's account is a resurrection. The dead who died faithful are raised bodily, joined with those still alive at the moment of his return, and a period the text calls 1,000 years begins, during which Revelation says, Satan himself is bound and cast into a pit and sealed there, unable to deceive the nations for that entire span of time. Christian traditions genuinely diverge on this point, and it's one of the oldest, most persistent disagreements in the entire history of the faith. Some read this 1,000 years as a literal future era of visible peace on earth, with Christ physically reigning from Jerusalem. Others read it symbolically, as a picture of the current age of the church between the first and second coming, rather than a distinct future era still to come. Still others read it as a shorter, more compressed transitional period. We're not going to pretend that disagreement doesn't exist or pick a side for you. It's a genuine, centuries-old fault line running straight through serious, faithful scholarship. But every major tradition converges again at the very end of the sequence. After this period, however long or symbolic it turns out to be, the text describes a final release. Satan loosed once more for a short time, one last gathering of opposition against the holy city, described using the ancient names Gog and Magog, pulled from an older vision in the book of Ezekiel, and then a final, decisive defeat. Fire from heaven ending the conflict before it can properly begin. The tradition also describes this resurrection as happening in two separate stages, rather than one single moment for everyone at once. The faithful dead raised first, at the beginning of this contested interval, and then, only afterward, at its conclusion. A second, final resurrection that includes everyone else who has ever lived, brought forward specifically to stand for judgment. Some traditions call this simply the first resurrection and the second resurrection. Others fold the language differently. Either way, the structure is consistent. There isn't one universal wake-up moment for all of history simultaneously. There are two, separated by whatever this contested interval actually turns out to be. What comes immediately after is a final, cosmic courtroom scene. Every person who has ever lived, resurrected, and standing before what the text calls a great white throne, judged not by rumor, reputation, or which side of history they happen to be born into, but, Revelation says, according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. Death itself, the text insists, is finally undone at this point, described as being thrown into the lake of fire alongside the grave itself, its own defeat rendered permanent, not a location for the living, but the ending of an enemy. And then, in the final two chapters of the entire Bible, comes the actual ending. And it is worth pausing here, because this is the part almost never makes it into the trailers, the thumbnails, or the sermons built entirely around fear. It is not fire and destruction as the very last word. It's restoration. A new heaven and a new earth. A holy city described descending from above rather than being built by human hands. Gates that are never shut because there is no longer any threat left to shut them against. And language that deliberately, unmistakably, echoes all the way back to the very first garden in the book of Genesis. A river, a tree of life, bearing fruit every month. No more curse anywhere in creation. No more death. No more mourning or crying or pain. God himself dwelling directly among people again, face to face, exactly the way the very first pages of Scripture describe things being before anything went wrong in the first place. The last book of the entire Bible ends, quite literally, by undoing the opening problem of the first one. There's one more scene tucked into this sequence that almost never gets mentioned outside of academic commentaries, and it's worth including here because it changes the tone of the whole ending. Just before Christ's return in Revelation 19, the text describes what it calls the marriage supper of the Lamb, a wedding feast, celebrated in heaven, with the church itself described as the bride, clothed in fine linen, bright and pure. It's an odd, almost jarring image to find sitting directly beside battle scenes and falling stars, and that's arguably the point. The dominant emotional key of this entire sequence, according to the text itself, isn't dread building toward dread. It's dread giving way, deliberately and specifically, to a wedding. That's the full arc, according to the tradition, from beginning to end. A false peace, a broken covenant, an act of desolation, a period of cascading collapse, a sudden and universally visible interruption, a resurrection, a long contested interval, one final rebellion, a final judgment, and, this part almost never makes it into the trailers, a restoration, not annihilation. Restoration. Part 8, the question left open. Here's what we're not going to do in this final section. We are not going to point at a real, currently living politician, a specific country, or a specific ongoing conflict, and tell you, that's him, that's it. It's happening right now. Every single person in history who has done exactly that, everyone, without exception, going back to the 2nd century, has been wrong. We just spent the better part of half an hour proving that to you, name by name, century by century. But we also promised you an honest answer, not a cop-out. So here it is, as honestly as we can put it. The pattern the text describes isn't a person. It's a set of conditions. A moment of global crisis severe enough that people are genuinely desperate for a unifying solution, willing to accept nearly anyone who promises to end it. A leader, or, some readers of these texts would argue, a system, since the text itself never strictly insists it has to be one man standing alone, rather than an office, an institution, or a structure, who arrives offering peace and stability, not conquest, and is embraced rather than feared, at least at first, precisely because the alternative feels unbearable. A world so economically interconnected, so dependent on shared systems, that participation in ordinary life can plausibly be made conditional on loyalty to one authority. And a moment, somewhere down the line, when that peace reveals itself to have been a lie all along, all at once, in a single, visible act. We're not going to tell you whether any of the pieces of that pattern are visible right now, today, in the world outside your window. That's not a question a history video can honestly answer for you, and frankly, anyone who tells you they can answer it with total certainty is doing exactly what every single wrong guess in this video already did. From Nero all the way through Y2K. If it's any comfort, this isn't actually a new dilemma the text leaves believers stranded with. Jesus himself, according to the Gospels, was asked this exact question directly by his own disciples. When will this happen? And how will we know? And his answer, recorded in Matthew 24, is notably not a date or a checklist of geopolitical triggers to watch on the news. It's a warning about false certainty itself. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will lead many astray. And then even more pointedly, concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. If the tradition's own central figure is recorded declining to give a date or a name, that's arguably the strongest argument in this entire video against anyone else claiming to have solved it since. What we can tell you is this: the reason this story has survived, unbroken, refitted onto tyrant after tyrant, for 2,000 years, isn't because it's vague nonsense flexible enough to mean anything to anyone. It's because the shape it describes, a false peace that breaks, a system that demands total loyalty as the price of participation, an ending that arrives suddenly and not by human hands, is a shape human history keeps almost fitting, generation after generation, without a single generation yet completing it. Maybe that's the actual ending worth sitting with, after everything else we've walked through tonight. Not a name, not a date, a pattern old enough to have outlived Nero, outlived the rival popes, outlived Napoleon, outlived every 20th century tyrant history threw at it in turn. A pattern that has never yet, not once in 2,000 years of confident guessing, completed itself. And the honest, unsettling question the text ultimately leaves you with isn't, who is he? It's this: would you actually recognize him if the story finally did finish in your own lifetime? Or would you, like every single generation that came before you, only be certain once it was already too late to matter?